Welcome back, everyone, ready for another deep dive. Today, we're going down a dark path, exploring the case of serial killer Nathaniel Code.
Oh, a heavy one. I've been looking over the research you sent me.
Yeah, mostly from his Wikipedia page, and you know our listeners. They always want to get to the bottom of things, understand what makes someone capable of such horrific acts.
It's the age-old question, isn't it? What turns someone into a serial killer? And the answer, well, there's rarely just one, but I always find going back to the beginning, looking at their early life, can be incredibly revealing.
Right, like piecing together a puzzle.
Mm.
So Nathaniel Coe, he was born in Shreveport, Louisiana, March 12, 1956.
Hmm.
And right off the bat, his childhood was, well, pretty rough.
Oh,
His parents divorced just 6 months after he was born.
6 months.
Yeah, just 6 months. And he ended up being raised by his great-aunt and grandfather.
That early separation, it can be really disruptive, you know? I mean, not every child from a divorced family ends up with trauma, but research does show that kind of instability early on, it can really mess with a child's development, emotional and social. Makes it so much harder to understand why things happen later on.
It's like that foundation is shaky from the start.
Exactly.
And in Coach's case, there were some strange things, even beyond the family issues. One source mentions this weird habit he had. Even as a kid, he would just stop mid-sentence and stare blankly for a while. Then just pick up where he left off, like nothing happened.
Now that is interesting.
I don't know about you, but that's kind of creepy.
Creepy, yeah, but it could be significant. It makes me think of dissociation, you know, when someone disconnects from their thoughts, feelings, memories, their sense of self, even.
Oh, like a coping mechanism,
Exactly.
especially for dealing with trauma, especially in childhood. Okay. But then things get, well, even darker. There are allegations that as a teenager, Code was setting animals on fire. And that brings to mind the McDonald triad: animal cruelty, fire setting, and bedwetting.
Ah, yes. The McDonald triad, definitely a red flag.
So are we looking at a textbook case here?
Well, it's not a guaranteed predictor of future violence, of course, but, you know, when you see those behaviors together, it often suggests something is off developmentally, psychologically.
Like what?
Lack of empathy, a fascination with control, a desensitization to suffering, you know, sadly, traits we see in a lot of violent offenders.
So already seeing some disturbing patterns in Code's early years. But then, as he enters his teenage years, things really start to escalate. He drops out of high school after failing ninth grade, moves in with his uncle, Johnny Boyd.
Sounds like he was struggling.
Yeah. And in 1971, he gets into a fight with his uncle. And get this, the uncle, Boyd, he shoots him.
What?
Not once, but 4 times.
Oh my God. That's intense. Physically and psychologically, that kind of violence, especially from family, it can have lasting consequences. It's hard to imagine processing that kind of betrayal and aggression without it leaving some serious scars.
I know. You think about the trauma,
Mm-mm.
and it's almost unbelievable that he even survived. He managed to run 4 blocks after being shot 4 times before collapsing.
Wow, the adrenaline must have been pumping. But it also makes you think about his state of mind in that moment, you know? Like, his body's responding to the threat, but his mind, maybe it's struggling to grasp what's happening.
Yeah, just running on pure instinct.
It's a strange disconnect. And unfortunately for Code, that incident was just the beginning. In 1975, his behavior takes a very dark turn. He's arrested for aggravated rape and burglary. Oh, no. Pleads guilty to attempted aggravated rape, gets 15 years in prison.
15 years.
A major escalation. From cruelty to animals, violence against family to this, it's a pattern emerging. More brazen, more violent, consequences getting more severe.
Well, downward spiral.
And to make matters worse, while he's incarcerated, his birth mother dies.
Oh, wow. That's got to be devastating.
Uh,
Imagine dealing with all that, the guilt, the shame, locked up, and then losing your mother.
Grief and loss, they're tough anyway, but in his situation, amplified, isolated, confined, wrestling with everything he's done. It's a recipe for disaster. It could push someone further down a very dark path.
And that's what we're going to see happen, right?
Sadly, yes. After serving 9 years, he's released in 1984, tries to rebuild his life, even gets a job at Fitzgerald's Contractors.
Sounds promising.
Doesn't last. He's fired. Some kind of dispute. And it makes you wonder, was this a turning point? Did the setback reignite those violent tendencies?
A trigger?
Could be. Job loss is stressful for anyone, but for someone like Code, with his history, it's a crushing defeat. Rejection, failure, lack of control. Maybe all that fueled his rage.
And tragically, that rage explodes. Just a few months after losing his job, August 1984, he commits his first murder. The victim, 25-year-old Deborah Ann Ford.
The beginning of a nightmare.
What we know is that he entered her home through a bathroom window. It seems like he tampered with the screen to get in.
Planning. He wasn't just opportunistic, he sought her out. Deliberate.
Chilling.
Hmm.
And once inside, well, it seems there was a struggle. He bound her hands, gagged her, then stabbed her multiple times. Finally, he slit her throat.
The level of violence is, well, it suggests something more than just ending a life. That control, the domination, it's disturbing.
It's horrifying. They found her face down on the sofa. Police were stumped, called it a regular whodunit. Not much evidence. They even offered a reward. But Code, he just vanished.
The double life so many serial killers lead, blending in, seeming ordinary, while hiding this dark side. It's what makes them so hard to catch. And sadly, for Shreveport, this was just the beginning.
It's hard to believe that less than a year after Deborah Ann Ford's murder, Shreveport was hit with something even more horrific. The Cedar Grove Massacre. I mean, this wasn't just another murder. This was, well, a whole other level of violence.
Yeah, the Cedar Grove Massacre, it really changed everything. Not just for Code's story, but for how the police approached the whole case.
Right. Suddenly they weren't dealing with a whodunit anymore. They were facing a serial killer.
Exactly.
So July 19th, 1985, early morning, Code goes to a house on 72nd Street in Cedar Grove. And this time, there are 4 victims.
Four.
4. Vivian Cheney, she was 34, Billy Joe Harris, 28, and 2 teenagers. Carletha Colbert, just 15, and Jerry Colbert, 25.
Oh, that's awful.
It's more, well, it's hard to even talk about the details. Each murder was brutal. And to make it even worse, there were 2 little girls in the house, 7 and 10 years old. They survived by hiding.
Oh my God. It's tough to hear, but it's important to understand the patterns,
Yeah.
The violence, the need for control that comes out in these crimes.
Like, what do you mean?
Well, Billy Joe Harris, he was shot multiple times. His throat was slashed and he was bound. Jerry Colbert, shot in the head while he slept. And the women, the way they were bound, evidence of torture. It points to something more than just killing. There's a need to control, to inflict pain, to terrorize.
It's sick. And what happened to Carletha Colbert? I mean, she was found bound and gagged, almost decapitated.
I know, it's hard to hear. But the brutality, especially directed at a young girl like that, and the fact that her mother, Vivian, was probably there during the attack,
Yeah.
well, it suggests a level of depravity that's just...
Beyond comprehension.
Yeah. And those little girls surviving while others were targeted seemingly randomly. It adds another layer to Code's profile,
How so?
It suggests there wasn't a specific type of victim he was looking for. That randomness, it makes it even more terrifying for the community because it feels like anyone could be next. This is often a hallmark of what we call a disorganized killer.
So anyone could be a target. God, it's chilling. And when they found the bodies, I mean, a relative and a taxi driver discovered them. The scene was just horrific. Assistant Police Chief Sam Burns, he'd been on the force for 25 years, and even he said he'd never seen anything like it.
I can imagine. This is where the investigation takes a turn. They brought in Johnny Douglas, the famous FBI profiler.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of them.
He noticed some disturbing similarities between the murders of Deborah Ann Ford and Carletha Colbert, especially the manipulation, the domination, the control.
There's patterns we were talking about.
Exactly. And that connection, it was crucial. It told them they were dealing with a serial killer, not just isolated incidents.
So those details, those horrific details, helped them understand the killer's mind. But tragically, before they could catch him, Code struck again. And this time, his victims were people he knew.
This is where things get even darker, I think. The victims this time, they were close to him, and it really makes you question what was going on in his mind.
In August of 1987, he killed his own grandfather, William Code. He was 73 years old. And he also killed 2 young boys. Joe Robinson Jr., he was 12, and Eric Williams, just 8.
His own grandfather?
Yeah.
That's just a whole other level of disturbing. And it makes you question everything, the family bonds, the motivations.
Like, what could drive someone to do that?
Yeah.
And the way William Code was killed, he was stabbed 13 times, bound and gagged, just like some of the other victims. The brutality, it's hard to comprehend, especially when you think about it being his own family.
I agree. And those boys, the young boys, it's hard to wrap your head around it. Were they just in the wrong place at the wrong time? Did he see them as witnesses he had to silence? Or was it something even darker than that? A complete disregard for human life, no matter who it is.
God, it's terrifying. And it's really unsettling. After these murders, the police questioned Code, but only because he was related to William Code.
Mm.
It was almost by chance that they caught him. Yeah. It was during that routine questioning that they took his fingerprints. And guess what? They matched evidence not only from the 1987 murders, but also from the Cedar Grove massacre 2 years earlier.
Wow, talk about a breakthrough. Suddenly it all connected. No more doubts about his guilt. I mean, that's the power of forensic science, right? Something as simple as fingerprints can solve these complex cases.
It's amazing and heartbreaking. The community had been living in fear, and all along, it was someone they knew.
That's often the case with serial killers. They blend in, they seem normal. It's what makes it so shocking when the truth comes out.
It's like a betrayal. And even Code's wife, Vera, she insisted he was innocent. She testified that he was a good man, that he would never hurt anyone.
It's hard to accept, right? When someone you love is accused of something so horrific. But it happens a lot in these cases. Denial is a powerful force.
So then the trial starts in September 1990. The prosecution, they had so much evidence, witness testimony, the details of the crimes, and of course those fingerprints. They really painted a clear picture of Code as a serial killer.
They had to be thorough, leave no room for doubt.
And there was this one witness, Oscar Washington. He knew Code, and he said he saw him with blood on his arms the morning of the Cedar Grove massacre. Code told him he'd been in a fight and came out on top.
Placing him at the scene, that's huge. It corroborates everything else.
Right. It's like, how do you argue with that? But Code's lawyers, they tried. They said he couldn't have done it alone, that it would have taken multiple people to kill 4 victims like that.
Trying to create reasonable doubt, I suppose.
Yeah, but with all that evidence, especially the fingerprints and eyewitness account, it was a tough sell. They also tried to argue that even if he was guilty, he shouldn't get the death penalty because he might have mental health issues. They even brought up a possible diagnosis of borderline personality disorder.
That's a common defense strategy in these cases, trying to mitigate the punishment by highlighting mental health factors. It's a complicated issue for sure.
It is, but in this case, the jury didn't buy it. After all the evidence, all the testimony, they deliberated for just 1 hour. And then they came back with a guilty verdict. All 4 counts of first-degree murder. December 1990, Nathaniel Code was sentenced to death.
Wow, 1 hour. That tells you how strong the case was against him. It must have been a relief for the families, though, finally getting justice, even if it can't bring back their loved ones.
Absolutely. It was a moment of closure for the community, too.
Yeah.
But Code's story didn't end there. He ended up on death row at Louisiana State Penitentiary. And years later, he made headlines again when he filed a lawsuit about the prison conditions.
Oh, I remember that. The heat. Right. He was complaining about the heat.
Yeah, he said it was cruel and unusual punishment. And the families of the victims, they were outraged. They felt like he had no right to complain after what he had done.
It's understandable, that anger. It brings up all those questions of justice, What's fair, what's right?
Yeah. And so Nathaniel Code stayed on death row, fighting his execution. His case is one of those that really makes you think about the darkness that can be hidden inside someone who seems ordinary, and about the impact of violence, the scars it leaves on everyone involved.
Yeah.
It's tough, You learn about a case like this, and it just stays with you. All those questions. Was there any way to stop it? Any signs we missed?
Yeah, it's like the ghost of what if hanging over everything, right?
Yeah.
It's easy to look back and connect the dots, but when it's happening, it's not so clear.
We see it all laid out in front of us now. The troubled childhood, that weird behavior, the violence escalating, animal cruelty, attacking his uncle, the attempted rape conviction, prison, his mother dying. It's like it was all building to something awful.
Right. Those patterns are definitely there. But it's important to remember not everyone with a similar background ends up like this. There's so much more to it. It's like genetics, the environment, choices they make, even random things that happen.
So many factors.
It's a tangled web.
But how do we make sense of it? How do we, reconcile this image of him as an ordinary guy with the monster he became?
That's the puzzle, isn't it? And we don't always have all the pieces. And even the ones we do have, they don't always fit neatly. Trying to understand the mind of a serial killer, it's complicated.
It is. But one thing that really gets to me is how methodical his crimes were. The binding, the gagging, the overkill. It's all so planned out, so deliberate.
That's a crucial point, that level of control. It's not just about killing, it's about domination, terrorizing the victim. It's a dark glimpse into his psyche, and you see it a lot with serial killers. That need for power, getting satisfaction from inflicting pain.
God, it's chilling.
Yeah.
So what do we learn from all this? How do we prevent this from happening again?
That's the big question, right? The million-dollar question. We can't predict for sure who will become violent, but we can work towards a society that promotes empathy, mental health awareness, resources for early intervention.
What does that look like, practically speaking?
Well, it starts with education, I think. Teaching kids about empathy, how to resolve conflict, healthy relationships, creating spaces where people feel safe to express themselves, to ask for help when they need it.
Like a safety man.
Exactly. We need to make mental health services accessible, get rid of that stigma around seeking help, and we have to be aware of the warning signs, the animal cruelty, fire setting, aggression that escalates. We can't ignore those.
So it's a whole system, a change in how we think about mental health.
Yeah, a shift in our mindset, a commitment to early intervention, a willingness to talk about these tough issues, violence and what causes it.
It's a long road ahead, but we have to try, right?
Mhm.
For the victims, their families, for everyone.
Absolutely. We owe it to them and to ourselves to keep learning, keep working towards a safer, more compassionate world.
Well, this has been a tough deep dive for sure. Nathaniel Code's story, it's a reminder that evil can hide in plain sight, and understanding where it comes from, that's the first step to stopping it. Thanks for joining us on this journey. And to our listeners out there, we'll leave you with this thought. What can each of us do to build that kind of world? A world that values empathy, mental well-being, and getting help early on. It's something to think about. It might be the key to a better future for all of us.